Chapters 15 and 16 of Book 8 of Les Misérables Volume 3 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables Volume 3 by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8, Chapter 15, Jondrette makes his purchases. A few moments later, about 3 o'clock, Courfeyrac chanced to be passing along the Rue Mouffetard in company with Bossuet. The snow had redoubled in violence and filled the air. Bossuet was just saying to Courfeyrac, one would say, to see all these snowflakes fall, that there was a plague of white butterflies in heaven. All at once Bossuet caught sight of Marius coming up the street towards the barrier with a peculiar air. "Hold," said Bossuet, "there's Marius." "I saw him," said Courfeyrac. "Don't let's speak to him." "Why? He is busy." "With what?" "Don't you see his air?" "What air?" "He has the air of a man who is following someone." "That's true," said Bossuet. "Just see the eyes he is making," said Courfeyrac. "But who the deuce is he following?" "Some fine flowery bonneted wench. He's in love." "But," observed Bossuet, "I don't see any wench, nor any flowery bonnet in the street. There's not a woman round." Courfeyrac took a survey, and exclaimed, "He's following a man!" A man, in fact, wearing a grey cap, and whose grey beard could be distinguished, although they only saw his back, was walking along about 20 paces in advance of Marius. This man was dressed in a greatcoat, which was perfectly new and too large for him, and in a frightful pair of trousers, all hanging in rags and black with mud. Bossuet burst out laughing. "Who is that man?" "He?" retorted Courfeyrac. "He's a Pole. Poets are very fond of wearing the trousers of dealers in rabbit skins, and the overcoats of peers of France." "Let's see where Marius will go," said Bossuet. "Let's see where the man is going. Let's follow them, hey?" "Bossuet," exclaimed Courfeyrac, "eagle of Meaux, you are a prodigious brute. Follow a man who is following another man, indeed." They retraced their steps. Marius had, in fact, seen Jondrette passing along the Rue Mouffetard, and was spying on his proceedings. Jondrette walked straight ahead, without a suspicion that he was already held by a glance. He quitted the Rue Mouffetard, and Marius saw him enter one of the most terrible hovels in the Rue Gracieuse. He remained there about a quarter of an hour, then returned to the Rue Mouffetard. He halted at an ironmonger's shop, which then stood at the corner of the Rue Pierre Lombard, and a few minutes later Marius saw him emerge from the shop, holding in his hand a huge cold chisel with a white wood handle, which he concealed beneath his greatcoat. At the top of the Rue Petit-Gentilly, he turned to the left and proceeded rapidly to the Rue de Petit-Banquier. The day was declining. The snow, which had ceased for a moment, had just begun again. Marius posted himself on the watch at the very corner of the Rue de Petit-Banquier, which was deserted, as usual, and did not follow Jondrette into it. It was lucky that he did so, for, on arriving in the vicinity of the wall where Marius had heard the long-haired man and the bearded man conversing, Jondrette turned around, made sure that no one was following him, did not see him, then sprang across the wall and disappeared. The wasteland bordered by this wall communicated with the backyard of an ex-livery stable-keeper of bad repute, who had failed and who still kept a few old single-seated berlins under his sheds. Marius thought that it would be wise to profit by Jondrette's absence to return home. Moreover, it was growing late. Every evening Ma'am Bougon, when she set out for her dishwashing in town, had a habit of locking the door, which was always closed at dusk. Marius had given his key to the inspector of police. It was important, therefore, that he should make haste. Evening had arrived. Night had almost closed in. On the horizon, and in the immensity of space, there remained but one spot illuminated by the sun, and that was the moon. It was rising in a ruddy glow behind the low dome of Salpêtrière. Marius returned to number 50 to 52 with great strides. The door was still open when he arrived. He mounted the stairs on tiptoe and glided along the wall of the corridor to his chamber. This corridor, as the reader will remember, was bordered on both sides by attics, all of which were, for the moment, empty and to let. Bougon was in the habit of leaving all the doors open. As he passed one of these attics, Marius thought he perceived in the uninhabited cell the motionless heads of 4 men, vaguely lighted up by a remnant of daylight falling through a dormer window. Marius made no attempt to see, not wishing to be seen himself. He succeeded in reaching his chamber without being seen and without making any noise. It was high time. A moment later he heard Bougon take her departure, locking the door of the house behind her. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16, in which will be found the words to an English air which was in fashion in 1832. Marius seated himself on his bed. It might have been 5:30 o'clock. Only half an hour separated him from what was about to happen. He heard the beating of his arteries as one hears the ticking of a watch in the dark. He thought of the double march which was going on at that moment in the dark, crime advancing on one side, justice coming up on the other. He was not afraid, but he could not think without a shudder of what was about to take place. As is the case with all those who are suddenly assailed by an unforeseen adventure, the entire day produced upon him the effect of a dream, and in order to persuade himself that he was not the prey of a nightmare, he had to feel the cold barrels of the steel pistols in his trousers pockets. It was no longer snowing. The moon disengaged itself more and more clearly from the mist, and its light, mingled with the white reflection of the snow which had fallen, communicated to the chamber a sort of twilight aspect. There was a light in the Jondrette den. Marius saw the hole in the wall shining with a reddish glow which seemed bloody to him. It was true that the light could not be produced by a candle. However, there was not a sound in the Jondrette quarters, not a soul was moving there, not a soul speaking, not a breath. The silence was glacial and profound, and had it not been for that light, he might have thought himself next door to a sepulchre. Marius softly removed his boots and pushed them under his bed. Several minutes elapsed. Marius heard the lower door turn on its hinges. A heavy step mounted the staircase and hastened along the corridor. The latch of the hovel was noisily lifted. It was Jondrette returning. Instantly several voices arose. The whole family was in the garret, only it had been silent in the master's absence, like wolf whelps in the absence of the wolf. "It's I," said he. "Good evening, Daddy," yelped the girls. "Well," said the mother. "All's going first rate," responded Jondrette, "but my feet are beastly cold. Good, you have dressed up. You have done well. You must inspire confidence. All ready to go out. Don't forget what I told you. You will do everything sure. Rest easy." "Because," said Jondrette, and he left the phrase unfinished. Marius heard him lay something heavy on the table, probably the chisel which he had purchased. "By the way," said Jondrette, "have you been eating here?" "Yes," said the mother. "I got 3 large potatoes and some salt. I took advantage of the fire to cook them." "Good," returned Jondrette. "Tomorrow I will take you out to dine with me. We will have a duck and fixings. You shall dine like Charles X. All is going well." Then he added, "The mouse trap is open. The cats are there." He lowered his voice still further and said, "Put this in the fire." Marius heard the sound of charcoal being knocked with the tongs or some iron utensil, and Jondrette continued, "Have you greased the hinges of the door so that they will not squeak?" "Yes," replied the mother. "What time is it?" "Nearly 6. The half-hour struck from Saint-Médard a while ago." "The devil!" ejaculated Jondrette. "The children must go and watch. Come you, do you listen here." A whispering ensued. Jondrette's voice became audible again. "Has old Bougon left?" "Yes," said the mother. "Are you sure that there is no one in our neighbour's room?" "He has not been in all day, and you know very well that this is his dinner hour." "You are sure?" "Sure." "All the same," said Jondrette, "there's no harm in going to see whether he is there. Here, my girl, take the candle and go there." Marius fell on his hands and knees and crawled silently under his bed. Hardly had he concealed himself when he perceived a light through the crack of his door. "Papa," cried a voice, "he is not in here." He recognized the voice of the eldest daughter. "Did you go in?" demanded her father. "No," replied the girl, "but as his key is in the door, he must be out." The father exclaimed, "Go in, nevertheless." The door opened, and Marius saw the tall Jondrette come in with a candle in her hand. She was as she had been in the morning, only still more repulsive in this light. She walked straight up to the bed. Marius endured an indescribable moment of anxiety, but near the bed there was a mirror nailed to the wall, and it was thither that she was directing her steps. She raised herself on tiptoe and looked at herself in it. In the neighbouring room, the sound of iron articles being moved was audible. She smoothed her hair with the palm of her hand, and smiled into the mirror, humming with her cracked and sepulchral voice, "Nos amours endurent tout un semaine, mais que de bonheur les instants sont courts. Ça durait 8 jours, c'était bien la peine. Les temps des amours devaient durer toujours, devraient durer toujours, devraient durer toujours." In the meantime, Marius trembled. It seemed impossible to him that she should not hear his breathing. She stepped to the window and looked out with the half-foolish way she had. "How ugly Paris is when it has put on a white chemise," said she. She returned to the mirror and began again to put on airs before it, scrutinizing herself full face and three-quarters face in turn. "Well," cried her father, "what are you about there?" "I am looking under the bed and the furniture," she replied, continuing to arrange her hair. "There's no one here." "Booby," yelled her father, "come here this minute, and don't waste any time about it." "Coming, coming," said she, "one has no time for anything in this hovel." She hummed, "Vous me quittez pour aller à la gloire, mon triste cœur suivra partout." She cast a parting glance in the mirror and went out, shutting the door behind her. A moment more, and Marius heard the sound of the two young girls' bare feet in the corridor, and Jondrette's voice shouting to them, "Pay strict heed, one on the side of the barrier, the other at the corner of the Rue de Petit Banquier. Don't lose sight for a moment of the door of this house, and the moment you see anything, rush here on the instant, as hard as you can go. You have a key to get in." The eldest girl grumbled, "The idea of standing watch in the snow barefoot." "Tomorrow you shall have some dainty little green silk boots," said the father. They ran downstairs, and a few seconds later the shock of the outer door as it banged to announce that they were outside. There now remained in the house only Marius, the Jondrettes, and probably also the mysterious persons of whom Marius had caught a glimpse in the twilight behind the door of the unused attic. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 to 18 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 3 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 3 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8 The Wicked Poor Man. Chapter 17 The Use Made of Marius's 5-franc piece. Marius decided that the moment had now arrived when he must resume his post at his observatory. In a twinkling, and with the agility of his age, he had reached the hole in the partition. He looked. The interior of the Jondrette apartment presented a curious aspect, and Marius found an explanation of this singular light which he had noticed. A candle was burning in a candlestick covered with verdigris, but that was not what really lighted the chamber. The hovel was completely illuminated, as it were, by the reflection from a rather large sheet-iron brazier standing in the fireplace, and filled with burning charcoal, the brazier prepared by the Jondrette woman that morning. The charcoal was glowing hot, and the brazier was red. A blue flame flickered over it, and helped him to make out the form of the chisel purchased by Jondrette in the Rue Pierre-Lombard, where it had been thrust into the brazier to heat. In one corner, near the door, and as though prepared for some definite use, 2 heaps were visible, which appeared to be, the one a heap of old iron, the other a heap of ropes. All this would have caused the mind of a person who knew nothing of what was in preparation to waver between a very sinister and a very simple idea. The lair thus lighted up more resembled a forge than a mouth of hell, but Jondrette, in this light, had rather the air of a demon than of a smith. The heat of the brazier was so great that the candle on the table was melting on the side next the chafing dish, and was drooping over. An old dark lantern of copper, worthy of Diogenes turned cartouche, stood on the chimney-piece. The brazier, placed in the fireplace itself, beside the nearly extinct brands, sent its vapours up the chimney and gave out no odour. The moon, entering through the 4 panes of the window, cast its whiteness into the crimson and flaming garret, and to the poetic spirit of Marius, who was dreamy even in the moment of action, it was like a thought of heaven mingled with the misshapen reveries of earth. A breath of air which made its way in through the open pane helped to dissipate the smell of the charcoal and to conceal the presence of the brazier. The Jondrette lair was, if the reader recalls what we have said of the Gorbeau building, admirably chosen to serve as the theatre of a violent and sombre deed, and as the envelope for a crime. It was the most retired chamber in the most isolated house, on the most deserted boulevard in Paris. If the system of ambush and traps had not already existed, they would have been invented there. The whole thickness of a house and a multitude of uninhabited rooms separated this den from the boulevard, and the only window that existed opened on waste lands enclosed with walls and palisades. Jondrette had lighted his pipe, seated himself on the seatless chair, and was engaged in smoking. His wife was talking to him in a low tone. If Marius had been Courfeyrac, that is to say, one of those men who laugh on every occasion in life, he would have burst with laughter when his gaze fell on the Jondrette woman. She had on a black bonnet with plumes not unlike the hats of the heralds at arms at the coronation of Charles X, an immense tartan shawl over her knitted petticoat, and the man's shoes which her daughter had scorned in the morning. It was this toilette which had extracted from Jondrette the exclamation, "Good, you have dressed up. You have done well. You must inspire confidence." As for Jondrette, he had not taken off the new surtout which was too large for him, and which Monsieur Leblanc had given him, and his costume continued to present that contrast of coat and trousers which constituted the ideal of a poet in Courfeyrac's eyes. All at once Jondrette lifted up his voice. "By the way, now that I think of it, in this weather he will come in a carriage. Light the lantern, take it, and go downstairs. You will stand behind the lower door. The very moment that you hear the carriage stop, you will open the door, instantly he will come up, you will light the staircase in the corridor, and when he enters here, you will go downstairs again as speedily as possible, you will pay the coachman, and dismiss the fiacre." "And the money?" inquired the woman. Jondrette fumbled in his trousers pocket and handed her 5 francs. "What's this?" she exclaimed. Jondrette replied with dignity, "That is the monarch which our neighbour gave us this morning." And he added, "Do you know what? 2 chairs will be needed here." "What for?" "To sit on." Marius felt a cold chill pass through his limbs at hearing this mild answer from Jondrette. "Pardieu, I'll go and get one of our neighbours." And with a rapid movement she opened the door of the den and went out into the corridor. Marius absolutely had not the time to descend from the commode, reach his bed, and conceal himself beneath it. "Take the candle," cried Jondrette. "No," said she, "it would embarrass me. I have the 2 chairs to carry. There is moonlight." Marius heard Mother Jondrette's heavy hand fumbling at his lock in the dark. The door opened. He remained nailed to the spot with the shock and with horror. The Jondrette entered. The dormer window permitted the entrance of a ray of moonlight between 2 blocks of shadow. One of these blocks of shadow entirely covered the wall against which Marius was leaning, so that he disappeared within it. Mother Jondrette raised her eyes, did not see Marius, took the 2 chairs, the only ones which Marius possessed, and went away, letting the door fall heavily to behind her. She re-entered the lair. "Here are the 2 chairs." "And here is the lantern. Go down as quick as you can." She hastily obeyed, and Jondrette was left alone. He placed the 2 chairs on opposite sides of the table, turned the chisel in the brazier, set in front of the fireplace an old screen which masked the chafing dish, then went to the corner where lay the pile of rope, and bent down as though to examine something. Marius then recognized the fact that what he had taken for a shapeless mass was a very well-made rope ladder, with wooden rungs and 2 hooks with which to attach it. This ladder and some large tools, veritable masses of iron, which were mingled with the old iron piled up behind the door, had not been in the Jondrette hovel in the morning, and had evidently been brought thither in the afternoon during Marius's absence. "Those are the utensils of an edge-tool maker," thought Marius. Had Marius been a little more learned in this line, he would have recognized in what he took for the engines of an edge-tool maker certain instruments which will force a lock or pick a lock, and others which will cut or slice, the 2 families of tools which burglars call cadets and fauchants. The fireplace and the 2 chairs were exactly opposite Marius. The brazier being concealed, the only light in the room was now furnished by the candle. The smallest bit of crockery on the table or on the chimney-piece cast a large shadow. There was something indescribably calm, threatening, and hideous about this chamber. One felt that there existed in it the anticipation of something terrible. Jondrette had allowed his pipe to go out, a serious sign of preoccupation, and had again seated himself. The candle brought out the fierce and the fine angles of his countenance. He indulged in scowls and in abrupt unfoldings of the right hand, as though he were responding to the last counsels of a sombre inward monologue. In the course of one of these dark replies which he was making to himself, he pulled the table drawer rapidly towards him, took out a long kitchen knife which was concealed there, and tried the edge of its blade on his nail. That done, he put the knife back in the drawer and shut it. Marius, on his side, grasped the pistol in his right pocket, drew it out, and cocked it. The pistol emitted a sharp, clear click as he cocked it. Jondrette started, half rose, listened a moment, then began to laugh and said, "What a fool I am! It's the partition cracking." Marius kept the pistol in his hand. Chapter 18. Marius's 2 chairs form a vis-a-vis. Suddenly, the distant and melancholy vibration of a clock shook the panes. 6 o'clock was striking from Saint-Médard. Jondrette marked off each stroke with a toss of his head. When the 6th had struck, he snuffed the candle with his fingers. Then he began to pace up and down the room, listened at the corridor, walked on again, then listened once more. "Provided only that he comes," he muttered, then returned to his chair. He had hardly reseated himself when the door opened. Mother Jondrette had opened it, and now remained in the corridor making a horrible, amiable grimace, which one of the holes of the dark lantern illuminated from below. "Enter, sir," she said. "Enter, my benefactor," repeated Jondrette, rising hastily. Monsieur Leblanc made his appearance. He wore an air of serenity which rendered him singularly venerable. He laid 4 louis on the table. "Monsieur Fabantou," said he, "this is for your rent and your most pressing necessities. We will attend to the rest hereafter." "May God requite it to you, my generous benefactor," said Jondrette, and rapidly approaching his wife, dismissed the carriage. She slipped out while her husband was lavishing salutes and offering Monsieur Leblanc a chair, An instant later she returned and whispered in his ear, "'Tis done." The snow, which had not ceased falling since the morning, was so deep that the arrival of the fiacre had not been audible, and they did not now hear its departure. Meanwhile, Monsieur Leblanc had seated himself. Jondrette had taken possession of the other chair, facing Monsieur Leblanc. Now, in order to form an idea of the scene which is to follow, let the reader picture to himself in his own mind a cold night, the solitudes of the Salpêtrière covered with snow and white as winding sheets in the moonlight, the taper-like lights of the street lanterns which shone redly here and there along those tragic boulevards, and the long rows of black elms, not a passer-by for perhaps a quarter of a league around, the Gorbeau hovel at its highest pitch of silence, of horror, and of darkness. In that building, in the midst of those solitudes, in the midst of that darkness, the vast Jondrette garret lighted by a single candle, and in that den 2 men seated at a table, Monsieur Leblanc tranquil, Jondrette smiling and alarming, the Jondrette woman, the female wolf, in one corner, and, behind the partition, Marius, invisible, erect, not losing a word, not missing a single movement, his eye on the watch, and pistol in hand. However, Marius experienced only an emotion of horror, but no fear. He clasped the stock of the pistol firmly, and felt reassured. "I shall be able to stop that wretch whenever I please," he thought. He felt that the police were there somewhere in ambuscade, waiting for the signal agreed upon, and ready to stretch out their arm. Moreover, he was in hopes that this violent encounter between Jondrette and Monsieur Leblanc would cast some light on all the things which he was interested in learning. End of Book 8, Chapters 17 to 18.
Chapter 19 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8, The Wicked Poor Man. Chapter 19. Occupying oneself with obscure depths. Hardly was Monsieur Leblanc seated when he turned his eyes towards the pallets, which were empty. "How is the poor little wounded girl?" he inquired. "Bad," replied Jondrette with a heartbroken and grateful smile. "Very bad, my worthy sir. Her elder sister has taken her to the Bourbe to have her hurt dressed. You will see them presently. They will be back immediately." "Madame Fabantou seems to me to be better," went on Monsieur Leblanc, casting his eyes on the eccentric costume of the Jondrette woman, as she stood between him and the door, as though already guarding the exit, and gazed at him in an attitude of menace and almost of combat. "She is dying," said Jondrette, "but what do you expect, sir? She has so much courage, that woman has. She's not a woman, she's an ox." The Jondrette, touched by his compliment, deprecated it with the affected airs of a flattered monster. "You are always too good to me, Monsieur Jondrette." "Jondrette?" said Monsieur Leblanc. "I thought your name was Fabantou." "Fabantou alias Jondrette," replied the husband hurriedly, "an artistic sobriquet." And, launching at his wife a shrug of the shoulders which Monsieur Leblanc did not catch, he continued with an emphatic and caressing inflection of voice. "Ah, we have had a happy life together, this poor darling and I. What would there be left for us if we had not that? We are so wretched, my respectable sir. We have arms, but there is no work. We have the will, no work. I don't know how the government arranges that, but on my word of honor, sir, I am not Jacobin, sir. I am not a Boussingault. I don't wish them any evil, but if I were the ministers, on my most sacred word, things would be different. Here, for instance, I wanted to have my girls taught the trade of paper box makers. You will say to me, what, a trade? Yes, a trade, a simple trade, a breadwinner. What a fall, my benefactor, what a degradation when one has been what we have been. Alas, there is nothing left to us of our days of prosperity. One thing only, a picture. of which I think a great deal, but which I am willing to part with, for I must live. Item, one must live." While Jondrette thus talked with an apparent incoherence which detracted nothing from the thoughtful and sagacious expression of his physiognomy, Marius raised his eyes and perceived at the other end of the room a person whom he had not seen before. A man had just entered so softly that the door had not been heard to turn on its hinges. This man wore a violet knitted vest, which was old, worn, spotted, cut and gaping at every fold, wide trousers of cotton velvet, wooden shoes on his feet, no shirt, had his neck bare, his bare arms tattooed, and his face smeared with black. He had seated himself in silence on the nearest bed, and as he was behind Jondrette, he could only be indistinctly seen. That sort of magnetic instinct which turns aside the gaze caused M. Leblanc to turn round almost at the same moment as Marius. He could not refrain from a gesture of surprise which did not escape Jondrette. "Ah, I see," exclaimed Jondrette, buttoning up his coat with an air of complaisance. "You are looking at your overcoat. It fits me, my faith, but it fits me." "Who is that man?" said M. Leblanc. "Him?" ejaculated Jondrette. "He's a neighbor of mine. Don't pay any attention to him." The neighbor was a singular-looking individual. However, manufactories of chemical products abound in the Faubourg Saint-Marceau. Many of the workmen might have black faces. Besides this, M. Leblanc's whole person was expressive of candid and intrepid confidence. He went on. "Excuse me, what were you saying, Monsieur Fabantou?" "I was telling you, sir, and dear protector," replied Jondrette, placing his elbows on the table and contemplating M. Leblanc with steady and tender eyes, not unlike the eyes of the boa constrictor. "I was telling you that I have a picture to sell." A slight sound came from the door. A second man had just entered and seated himself on the bed behind Jondrette. Like the first, his arms were bare, and he had a mask of ink or lamp-black. Although this man had literally glided into the room, he had not been able to prevent M. Leblanc catching sight of him. "Don't mind them," said Jondrette. "They are people who belong in the house. So, I was saying that there remains in my possession a valuable picture. But stop, sir, take a look at it." He rose, went to the wall, at the foot of which stood the panel which we have already mentioned, and turned it round, still leaving it supported against the wall. It really was something which resembled a picture, and which the candle illuminated somewhat. Marius could make nothing out of it, as Jondrette stood between the picture and him. He only saw a coarse daub and a sort of principal personage covered with the harsh crudity of foreign canvases and screen paintings. "What is that?" asked M. Leblanc. Jondrette exclaimed, "A painting by a master, a picture of great value, my benefactor. I am as much attached to it as I am to my 2 daughters. It recalls souvenirs to me. But I have told you, and I will not take it back, that I am so wretched that I will part with it." Either by chance, or because he had begun to feel a dawning uneasiness, M. Leblanc's glance returned to the bottom of the room as he examined the picture. There were now 4 men, 3 seated on the bed, 1 standing near the door-post, all 4 with bare arms and motionless, with faces smeared with black. One of those on the bed was leaning against the wall with closed eyes, and it might have been supposed that he was asleep. He was old. His white hair contrasting with his blackened face produced a horrible effect. The other 2 seemed to be young. One wore a beard, the other wore his hair long. None of them had on shoes. Those who did not wear socks were barefooted. Jondrette noticed that M. Leblanc's eye was fixed on these men. "They are friends, they are neighbors," said he. "Their faces are black because they work in charcoal. They are chimney builders. Don't trouble yourself about them, my benefactor, but buy my picture. Have pity on my misery. I will not ask you much for it. How much do you think it is worth?" "Well," said M. Leblanc, looking Jondrette full in the eye, and with the manner of a man who is on his guard, It is some signboard for a tavern, and is worth about 3 francs. Jondrette replied sweetly, "Have you your pocket-book with you? I should be satisfied with 1,000 crowns." Monsieur Leblanc sprang up, placed his back against the wall, and cast a rapid glance around the room. He had Jondrette on his left, on the side next the window, and the Jondrette woman and the 4 men on his right, on the side next the door. The 4 men did not stir, and did not even seem to be looking on. Jondrette had again begun to speak in a plaintive tone, with so vague an eye, and so lamentable an intonation, that Monsieur Leblanc might have supposed that what he had before him was a man who had gone simply mad with misery. "If you do not buy my picture, my dear benefactor," said Jondrette, "I shall be left without resources. There will be nothing left for me but to throw myself into the river. When I think that I wanted to have my 2 girls taught the middle-class paper-box trade, the making of boxes for New Year's gifts. Well, a table with a board at the end to keep the glasses from falling off is required. Then a special stove is needed, a pot with 3 compartments for the different degrees of strength of the paste, according as it is to be used for wood, paper, or stuff, a paring knife to cut the cardboard, a mould to adjust it, a hammer to nail the steels, pincers, how the devil do I know what all? And all that in order to earn 4 sous a day. And you have to work 14 hours a day, and each box passes through the workwoman's hands 13 times, and you can't wet the paper, and you mustn't spot anything, and you must keep the paste hot. The devil, I tell you, 4 sous a day. How do you suppose a man is to live?" As he spoke, Jondrette did not look at Monsieur Leblanc, who was observing him. Monsieur Leblanc's eye was fixed on Jondrette, and Jondrette's eye was fixed on the door. Marius's eager attention was transferred from one to the other. Monsieur Leblanc seemed to be asking himself, "Is this man an idiot?" Jondrette repeated 2 or 3 distinct times, with all manner of varying inflections of the whining and supplicating order, "There is nothing left for me but to throw myself into the river. I went down 3 steps at the side of the bridge of Austerlitz the other day for that purpose." All at once his dull eyes lighted up with a hideous flash. The little man drew himself up and became terrible, took a step toward Monsieur Leblanc, and cried in a voice of thunder, "That has nothing to do with the question. Do you know me?" End of Book 8, Chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 3 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 3 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8. The Wicked Poor Man. Chapter 20. The Trap. The door of the garret had just opened abruptly, and allowed a view of 3 men clad in blue linen blouses, and masked with masks of black paper. The first was thin, and had a long, iron-tipped cudgel. The second, who was a sort of colossus, carried by the middle of the handle, with the blade downward, a butcher's pole-axe for slaughtering cattle. The third, a man with thick-set shoulders, not so slender as the first, held in his hand an enormous key, stolen from the door of some prison. It appeared that the arrival of these men was what Jondrette had been waiting for. A rapid dialogue ensued between him and the man with the cudgel, the thin one. "Is everything ready?" said Jondrette. "Yes," replied the thin man. "Where is Montparnasse?" "The young principal actor stopped to chat with your girl." "Which?" "The eldest." "Is there a carriage at the door?" "Yes." "Is the team harnessed?" "Yes." "With 2 good horses?" "Excellent." "Is it waiting where I ordered?" "Yes." "Good," said Jondrette. Monsieur Leblanc was very pale. He was scrutinizing everything around him in the den, like a man who understands what he has fallen into, and his head, directed in turn toward all the heads which surrounded him, moved on his neck with an astonished and attentive slowness, but there was nothing in his air which resembled fear. he had improvised an entrenchment out of the table, and the man, who but an instant previously had borne merely the appearance of a kindly old man, had suddenly become a sort of athlete, and placed his robust fist on the back of his chair, with a formidable and surprising gesture. This old man, who was so firm and so brave in the presence of such a danger, seemed to possess one of those natures which are as courageous as they are kind, both easily and simply. The father of a woman whom we love is never a stranger to us. Marius felt proud of that unknown man. 3 of the men of whom Jondrette had said, "They are chimney builders," had armed themselves from the pile of old iron, one with a heavy pair of shears, the second with weighing tongs, the third with a hammer, and had placed themselves across the entrance without uttering a syllable. The old man had remained on the bed, and had merely opened his eyes. The Jondrette woman had seated herself beside him. Marius decided that in a few seconds more the moment for intervention would arrive, and he raised his right hand toward the ceiling, in the direction of the corridor, in readiness to discharge his pistol. Jondrette, having terminated his colloquy with the man with the cudgel, turned once more to M. Leblanc, and repeated his question, accompanying it with that low, repressed, and terrible laugh which was peculiar to him. "So you do not recognize me?" M. Leblanc looked him full in the face, and replied, "No." Then Jondrette advanced to the table. He leaned across the candle, crossing his arms, putting his angular and ferocious jaw close to M. Leblanc's calm face, and advancing as far as possible without forcing M. Leblanc to retreat. And in this posture of a wild beast who is about to bite, he exclaimed, "My name is not Fabantou. My name is not Jondrette. My name is Thénardier. I am the innkeeper of Montfermeil. Do you understand? Thénardier. Now do you know me?" An almost imperceptible flush crossed M. Leblanc's brow, and he replied with a voice which neither trembled nor rose above its ordinary level, with his accustomed placidity, "No more than before?" Marius did not hear this reply. Anyone who had seen him at that moment through the darkness would have perceived that he was haggard, stupid, thunderstruck. At the moment when Jondrette said, "My name is Thénardier," Marius had trembled in every limb, and had leaned against the wall, as though he felt the cold of a steel blade through his heart. Then his right arm, all ready to discharge the signal shot, dropped slowly, and at the moment when Jondrette repeated, "Thénardier, do you understand?" Marius's faltering fingers had come near letting the pistol fall. Jondrette, by revealing his identity, had not moved M. Leblanc, but he had quite upset Marius. That name of Thénardier, with which M. Leblanc did not seem to be acquainted, Marius knew well. Let the reader recall what that name meant to him. That name he had worn on his heart, inscribed in his father's testament. He bore it at the bottom of his mind, in the depths of his memory, in that sacred injunction. "A certain Thénardier saved my life. If my son encounters him, he will do him all the good that lies in his power." That name, it will be remembered, was one of the pieties of his soul. He mingled it with the name of his father in his worship. What? This man was that Thénardier, that innkeeper of Montfermeil, whom he had so long and so vainly sought? He had found him at last, and how? His father's saviour was a ruffian. That man, to whose service Marius was burning to devote himself, was a monster. That liberator of Colonel Pontmercy was on the point of committing a crime whose scope Marius did not as yet clearly comprehend, but which resembled an assassination. And against whom, great God, what a fatality! What a bitter mockery of fate! His father had commanded him from the depths of his coffin to do all the good in his power to this Thénardier, and for 4 years Marius had cherished no other thought than to acquit this debt of his father's, and at the moment when he was on the eve of having a brigand seized in the very act of crime by justice, destiny cried to him, "This is Thénardier." He could at last repay this man for his father's life, saved amid a hailstorm of grape-shot on the heroic field of Waterloo, and repay it with the scaffold. He had sworn to himself that if ever he found that Thénardier, he would address him only by throwing himself at his feet. And now he actually had found him, but it was only to deliver him over to the executioner. His father said to him, "Succor Thénardier," and he replied to that adored and sated voice by crushing Thénardier. He was about to offer to his father in his grave the spectacle of that man who had torn him from death at the peril of his own life, executed on the Place Saint-Jacques through the means of his son, of that Marius of whom he had entrusted that man by his will. And what a mockery, to have so long worn on his breast his father's last commands, written in his own hand, only to act in so horribly contrary a sense. But on the other hand, now look on that trap, and not prevent it. Condemn the victim, and to spare the assassin. Could one be held to any gratitude towards so miserable a wretch? All the ideas which Marius had cherished for the last 4 years were pierced through and through, as it were, by this unforeseen blow. He shuddered. Everything depended on him. Unknown to themselves, he held in his hand all those beings who were moving about there before his eyes. If he fired the pistol, Monsieur Leblanc was saved, and Thénardier lost. If he did not fire, Monsieur Leblanc would be sacrificed, and who knows, Thénardier would escape. Should he dash down the one, or allow the other to fall? Remorse awaited him in either case. What was he to do? What should he choose? Be false to the most imperious souvenirs, to all those solemn vows to himself, to the most sacred duty, to the most venerated text? Should he ignore his father's testament, or allow the perpetration of a crime? On the one hand, it seemed to him that he heard his Ursule supplicating for her father, and on the other, the colonel commending Thénardier to his care. He felt that he was going mad. His knees gave way beneath him, and he had not even the time for deliberation, so great was the fury with which the scene before his eyes was hastening to its catastrophe. It was like a whirlwind, of which he had thought himself the master, and which was now sweeping him away. He was on the verge of swooning. In the meantime, Thénardier, whom we shall henceforth call by no other name, was pacing up and down in front of the table in a sort of frenzy and wild triumph. He seized the candle in his fist, and set it on the chimney-piece with so violent a bang that the wick came near being extinguished, and the tallow bespattered the wall. Then he turned to Monsieur Leblanc with a horrible look, and spit out these words: "Done for! Smoked brown! Cooked! Spitchcocked!" And again he began to march back and forth in full eruption. "Ah!" he cried, "so I've found you again at last, Mr. Philanthropist, Mr. Threadbare Millionaire, Mr. Giver of Dolls, you old ninny! Ha, so you don't recognize me. No, it wasn't you who came to Montfermeil, to my inn 8 years ago, on Christmas Eve 1823. It wasn't you who carried off that Fontaine's child from me. The lark! It wasn't you who had a yellow greatcoat, no, nor a package of duds in your hand, as you had this morning here. Say, wife, it seems to be his mania to carry packets of woolen stockings into houses. Old charity-monger, get out with you. Are you a hosier, Mr. Millionaire? You give away your stock-in-trade to the poor holy man. What bosh! Merry Andrew! Ah, and you don't recognize me. Well, I recognize you, that I do. I recognized you the very moment you poked your snout in here. Ha! you'll find out presently that it isn't all roses to thrust yourself in that fashion into people's houses, under the pretext that they are taverns, in wretched clothes, with the air of a poor man to whom one would give a sou, to deceive persons, to play the generous, to take away their means of livelihood, and to make threats in the woods. And you can't call things quits because afterwards, when people are ruined, you bring a coat that is too large and 2 miserable hospital blankets. You old blackguard, you child-stealer!" He paused, and seemed to be talking to himself for a moment. One would have said that his wrath had fallen into some hole like the Rhone. Then, as though he were concluding aloud the things which he had been saying to himself in a whisper, he smote the table with his fist and shouted, "And with his goody-goody air!" And apostrophizing Monsieur Leblanc, "Parbleu! You made game of me in the past. You are the cause of all my misfortunes. For 1,500 francs you got a girl whom I had, and who certainly belonged to rich people, and who had already brought in a great deal of money, and from whom I might have extracted enough to live on all my life. A girl who would have made up to me for everything that I lost in that vile cook-shop, where there was nothing but one continual row, and where, like a fool, I ate up my last farthing. Oh, I wish all the wine folks drank in my house had been poison to those who drank it. Well, never mind. Say now, you must have thought me ridiculous when you went off with the lark. You had your cudgel in the forest. You were the stronger. Revenge. I'm the one to hold the trumps today. You're in a sorry case, my good fellow. Oh, but I can laugh. Really, I laugh. Didn't he fall into the trap? I told him that I was an actor, that my name was Fabanteau, that I had played comedy with Mamselle Mars, with Mamselle Mouche, that my landlady insisted on being paid tomorrow, the 4th of February. And he didn't even notice that the 8th of January, and not the 4th of February, is the time when the quarter runs out. Absurd idiot! And the 4 miserable Philippes which he has brought me. Scoundrel! He hadn't the heart even to go as high as 100 francs. And how he swallowed my platitudes. That did amuse me. I said to myself, blockhead, come, I've got you. I lick your paws this morning, but I'll gnaw your heart this evening. Thénardier paused. He was out of breath. His little narrow chest panted like a forge bellows. His eyes were full of the ignoble happiness of a feeble, cruel, and cowardly creature, which finds that it can, at last, harass what it has feared, and insult what it has flattered. The joy of a dwarf who should be able to set his heel on the head of Goliath. The joy of a jackal which is beginning to rend a sick bull, so nearly dead that he can no longer defend himself, but sufficiently alive to suffer still. Monsieur Leblanc did not interrupt him, but said to him when he paused, "I do not know what you mean to say. You are mistaken in me. I am a very poor man, and anything but a millionaire. I do not know you. You are mistaking me for some other person." "Ah!" roared Thénardier hoarsely. "A pretty lie! You stick to that pleasantry, do you? You're floundering, my old buck. Ha! You don't remember. You don't see who I am." "Excuse me, sir," said Monsieur Leblanc, with a politeness of accent which at that moment seemed peculiarly strange and powerful. "I see that you are a villain." Who has not remarked the fact that odious creatures possess a susceptibility of their own, that monsters are ticklish? At this word, villain, the female Thénardier sprang from the bed. Thénardier grasped his chair as though he were about to crush it in his hands. "Don't you stir!" he shouted to his wife. And turning to Monsieur Leblanc, "Villain! Yes, I know you call us that, you rich gentlemen. Stop! It's true that I became bankrupt, that I am in hiding, that I have no bread, that I have not a single sou, that I am a villain. It's 3 days since I have had anything to eat, so I'm a villain. Ah, you folks warm your feet. You have Sikorsky boots. You have wadded greatcoats. Like archbishops, you lodge on the first floor in houses that have porters. You eat truffles. You eat asparagus at 40 francs the bunch in the month of January. And green peas. You gorge yourselves. And when you want to know whether it is cold, you look in the papers to see what the engineer Chevalier's thermometer says about it. It is we who are thermometers. We don't need to go out and look on the quay at the corner of the Tour de l'Horloge to find out the number of degrees of cold. We feel our blood congealing in our veins, and the ice forming round our hearts, and we say, there is no God. And you come to our caverns, yes, our caverns, for the purpose of calling us villains. But we'll devour you. Poor little things. Just see here, Mr. Millionaire. I have been a solid man. I have held a license. I have been an elector. I am a bourgeois, that I am. And it's quite possible that you are not. Here Thénardier took a step towards the men who stood near the door, and added with a shudder, when I think that he has dared to come here and talk to me like a cobbler. Then, addressing Monsieur Leblanc with a fresh outburst of frenzy, and listen to this, Mr. Philanthropist. I'm not a suspicious character, not a bit of it. I'm not a man whose name nobody knows, and who comes and abducts children from houses. I'm an old French soldier. I ought to have been decorated. I was at Waterloo, so I was. And in the battle, I saved a general called the Comte of I don't know what. He told me his name, but his beastly voice was so weak that I didn't hear. All I caught was merci. I'd rather have had his name than his thanks. That would have helped me to find him again. The picture that you see here, and which was painted by David at Bruxelles, do you know what it represents? It represents me. David wished to immortalize that feat of prowess. I have that general on my back, and I am carrying him through the grape shot. There's the history of it. That general never did a single thing for me. He was no better than the rest. But nonetheless, I saved his life at the risk of my own, and I have the certificate of the fact in my pocket. I am a soldier of Waterloo, by all the furies. And now that I have had the goodness to tell you all this, let's have an end of it. I want money. I want a deal of money. I must have an enormous lot of money, or I'll exterminate you by the thunder of the good God. Marius had regained some measure of control over his anguish, and was listening. The last possibility of doubt had just vanished. It certainly was the Thénardier of the will. Marius shuddered at that reproach of ingratitude directed against his father, and which he was on the point of so fatally justifying. His perplexity was redoubled. Moreover, there was in all these words of Thénardier, in his accent, in his gesture, in his glance which darted flames at every word, there was in this explosion of an evil nature disclosing everything, in that mixture of braggadocio and abjectness, of pride and pettiness, of rage and folly, in that chaos of real griefs and false sentiments, in that immodesty of a malicious man tasting the voluptuous delights of violence, in that shameless nudity of a repulsive soul, in that conflagration of all sufferings combined with all hatreds, something which was as hideous as evil, and as heart-rending as the truth. The picture of the master, the painting by David which he had proposed that Monsieur Leblanc should purchase, was nothing else, as the reader has divined, than the sign of his tavern, painted, as it will be remembered, by himself, the only relic which he had preserved from his shipwreck at Montfermeil. End of Part 1 of Book 8, Chapter 20.
Part 2 of Chapter 20 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 3 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 3 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8, The Wicked Poor Man. Chapter 20, The Trap, Part 2. As he had ceased to intercept Marius's visual array, Marius could examine this thing, and in the daub he actually did recognize a battle, a background of smoke, and a man carrying another man. It was the group composed of Pontmercy and Thénardier, the sergeant, the rescuer, the colonel rescued. Marius was like a drunken man. This picture restored his father to life in some sort. It was no longer the signboard of the wine shop at Montfermeil. It was a resurrection. A tomb had yawned. A phantom had risen there. Marius heard his heart beating in his temples. He had the cannon of Waterloo in his ears. His bleeding father, vaguely depicted on that sinister panel, terrified him, and it seemed to him that the misshapen spectre was gazing intently at him. When Thénardier had recovered his breath, he turned his bloodshot eyes on Monsieur Leblanc, and said to him in a low, curt voice, "What have you to say before we put the handcuffs on you?" Monsieur Leblanc held his peace. In the midst of this silence, a cracked voice launched this lugubrious sarcasm from the corridor. "If there's any wood to be split, I'm there." It was the man with the axe, who was growing merry. At the same moment, an enormous, bristling and clayey face made its appearance at the door, with a hideous laugh which exhibited not teeth, but fangs. It was the face of the man with the butcher's axe. "Why have you taken off your mask?" cried Thénardier in a rage. "For fun," retorted the man. For the last few minutes, Monsieur Leblanc had appeared to be watching and following all the movements of Thénardier, who, blinded and dazzled by his own rage, was stalking to and fro in the den with full confidence that the door was guarded, and of holding an unarmed man fast, he being armed himself, of being 9 against 1, supposing that the female Thénardier counted for but one man. During his address to the man with the pole-axe, he had turned his back to Monsieur Leblanc. Monsieur Leblanc seized this moment, overturned the chair with his foot and the table with his fist, and with one bound, with prodigious agility, before Thénardier had time to turn around, he had reached the window. To open it, to scale the frame, to bestride it, was the work of a second only. He was half out when 6 robust fists seized him and dragged him back energetically into the hovel. These were the 3 chimney-builders who had flung themselves upon him. At the same time, the Thénardier woman had wound her hands in his hair. At the trampling which ensued, the other ruffians rushed up from the corridor. The old man on the bed, who seemed under the influence of wine, descended from the pallet and came reeling up with a stone-breaker's hammer in his hand. One of the chimney-builders, whose smirched face was lighted up by the candle, and in whom Marius recognized, in spite of his daubing, Panchaud, alias Printanier, alias Bigrenaille, lifted above Monsieur Leblanc's head a sort of bludgeon made of 2 balls of lead at the 2 ends of a bar of iron. Marius could not resist this sight. "My father!" he thought. "Forgive me!" And his fingers sought the trigger of his pistol. The shot was on the point of being discharged when Thénardier's voice shouted, "Don't harm him!" This desperate attempt of the victim, far from exasperating Thénardier, had calmed him. There existed in him 2 men, the ferocious man and the adroit man. Up to that moment, in the excess of his triumph in the presence of the prey which had been brought down and which did not stir, the ferocious man had prevailed. When the victim struggled and tried to resist, the adroit man reappeared and took the upper hand. "Don't hurt him," he repeated, and without suspecting it, his first success was to arrest the pistol in the act of being discharged, and to paralyze Marius, in whose opinion the urgency of the case disappeared, and who, in the face of this new phase, saw no inconvenience in waiting a while longer. Who knows whether some chance would not arise which would deliver him from the horrible alternative of allowing Ursule's father to perish, or of destroying the colonel's savior? A Herculean struggle had begun. With one blow full in the chest, Monsieur Leblanc had sent the old man tumbling, rolling in the middle of the room. Then with 2 backward sweeps of his hand he had overthrown 2 more assailants, and he held one under each of his knees. The wretches were rattling in the throat beneath this pressure as under a granite millstone. But the other 4 had seized the formidable old man by both arms and the back of his neck, and were holding him doubled up over the 2 chimney-builders on the floor. Thus, the master of some and mastered by the rest, crushing those beneath him and stifling under those on top of him, endeavoring in vain to shake off all the efforts which were heaped upon him, Monsieur Leblanc disappeared under the horrible group of ruffians like the wild boar beneath a howling pile of dogs and hounds. They succeeded in overthrowing him upon the bed nearest the window, and there they held him in awe. The Thénardier woman had not released her clutch on his hair. "Don't you mix yourself up in this affair," said Thénardier. "You'll tear your shawl." The Thénardier obeyed, as the female wolf obeys the male wolf, with a growl. "Now," said Thénardier, "search him, you other fellows." Monsieur Leblanc seemed to have renounced the idea of resistance. They searched him. He had nothing on his person except a leather purse containing 6 francs and his handkerchief. Thénardier put the handkerchief into his own pocket. "What? No pocket-book?" he demanded. "No, nor watch," replied one of the chimney-builders. "Never mind," murmured the masked man who carried the big key in the voice of a ventriloquist. "He's a tough old fellow." Thénardier went to the corner near the door, picked up a bundle of ropes, and threw them at the men. "Tie him to the leg of the bed," said he. And, catching sight of the old man who had been stretched across the room by the blow from Monsieur Leblanc's fist, and who made no movement, he added, "Is Boulatruelle dead?" "No," replied Bigrenaille, "he's drunk." "Sweep him into a corner," said Thénardier. 2 of the chimney-builders pushed the drunken man into the corner near the heap of old iron with their feet. "Babette," said Thénardier in a low tone to the man with the cudgel, "why did you bring so many? They were not needed." "What can you do?" replied the man with the cudgel. "They all wanted to be in it. This is a bad season. There's no business going on." The pallet on which Monsieur Leblanc had been thrown was a sort of hospital bed, elevated on 4 coarse wooden legs, roughly hewn. Monsieur Leblanc let them take their own course. The ruffians bound him securely in an upright attitude, with his feet on the ground at the head of the bed, the end which was most remote from the window and nearest to the fireplace. When the last knot had been tied, Thénardier took a chair and seated himself almost facing Monsieur Leblanc. Thénardier no longer looked like himself. In the course of a few moments his face had passed from unbridled violence to tranquil and cunning sweetness. Marius found it difficult to recognize in that polished smile of a man in official life the almost bestial mouth which had been foaming but a moment before. He gazed with amazement on that fantastic and alarming metamorphosis, and he felt as a man might feel who should behold a tiger converted into a lawyer. "Monsieur," said Thénardier. And dismissing with a gesture the ruffians who still kept their hands on Monsieur Leblanc, "Stand off a little, and let me have a talk with the gentleman." All retired towards the door. He went on, "Monsieur, you did wrong to try to jump out of the window. You might have broken your leg. Now, if you will permit me, we will converse quietly. In the first place, I must communicate to you an observation which I have made, which is, that you have not uttered the faintest cry." Thénardier was right. This detail was correct, although it had escaped Marius in his agitation. Monsieur Leblanc had barely pronounced a few words without raising his voice, and even during his struggle with the 6 ruffians near the window, he had preserved the most profound and singular silence. Thénardier continued, "Mon Dieu! You might have shouted 'Stop, thief!' a bit, and I should not have thought it improper. Murder! That, too, is said occasionally, and, so far as I am concerned, I should not have taken it in bad part. It is very natural that you should make a little row when you find yourself with persons who don't inspire you with sufficient confidence. You might have done that, and no one would have troubled you on that account. You would not even have been gagged. And I will tell you why. This room is very private. That's its only recommendation, but it has that in its favor. You might fire off a mortar and it would produce about as much noise at the nearest police station as the snores of a drunken man. Here a cannon would make a boom, and the thunder would make a poof. It's a handy lodging, but, in short, you did not shout, and it is better so. I present you my compliments, and I will tell you the conclusion that I draw from that fact. My dear sir, when a man shouts, who comes? The police. And after the police? Justice. Well, you have not made an outcry. That is because you don't care to have the police and the courts come in any more than we do. It is because, I have long suspected it, you have some interest in hiding something. On our side we have the same interest, so we can come to an understanding." As he spoke thus, it seemed as though Thénardier, who kept his eyes fixed on Monsieur Leblanc, were trying to plunge the sharp points which darted from the pupils into the very conscience of his prisoner. Moreover, his language, which was stamped with a sort of moderated, subdued insolence and crafty insolence, was reserved and almost choice, and in that rascal, who had been nothing but a robber a short time previously, one now felt the man who had studied for the priesthood. The silence preserved by the prisoner, that precaution which had been carried to the point of forgetting all anxiety for his own life, that resistance opposed to the first impulse of nature, which is to utter a cry, all this, it must be confessed, now that his attention had been called to it, troubled Marius, and affected him with painful astonishment. Thénardier's well-grounded observation still further obscured for Marius the dense mystery which enveloped that grave and singular person on whom Courfeyrac had bestowed the sobriquet of Monsieur Leblanc. But whoever he was, bound with ropes, surrounded with executioners, half plunged, so to speak, in a grave which was closing in upon him to the extent of a degree with every moment that passed, in the presence of Thénardier's wrath, as in the presence of his sweetness, this man remained impassive, and Marius could not refrain from admiring at such a moment the superbly melancholy visage. Here, evidently, was a soul which was inaccessible to terror, and which did not know the meaning of despair. Here was one of those men who command amazement in desperate circumstances. Extreme as was the crisis, inevitable as was the catastrophe, there was nothing here of the agony of the drowning man who opens his horror-filled eyes under the water. Thénardier rose in an unpretending manner, went to the fireplace, shoved aside the screen, which he leaned against the neighboring pallet, and thus unmasked the brazier full of glowing coals, in which the prisoner could clearly see the chisel, white-hot and spotted here and there, with tiny scarlet stars. Then Thénardier returned to his seat beside Monsieur Leblanc. "I continue," said he. "We can come to an understanding. Let us arrange this matter in an amicable way. I was wrong to lose my temper just now. I don't know what I was thinking of. I went a great deal too far. I said extravagant things. For example, because you are a millionaire, I told you that I exacted money, a lot of money, a deal of money. That would not be reasonable. Mon Dieu, in spite of your riches, you have expenses of your own. Who has not? I don't want to ruin you. I am not a greedy fellow, after all. I am not one of those people who, because they have the advantage of the position, profit by the fact to make themselves ridiculous. Why, I'm taking things into consideration and making a sacrifice on my side. I only want 200,000 francs. Monsieur Leblanc uttered not a word. Thénardier went on. You see that I put not a little water in my wine. I'm very moderate. I don't know the state of your fortune, but I do know that you don't stick at money, and a benevolent man like yourself can certainly give 200,000 francs to the father of a family who is out of luck. Certainly you are reasonable, too. You haven't imagined that I should take all the trouble I have today and organize this affair this evening, which has been labor well bestowed, in the opinion of these gentlemen, merely to wind up by asking you for enough to go and drink red wine at 15 sous and eat veal at Desnoyers. 200,000 francs, it's surely worth all that. This trifle once out of your pocket, I guarantee you that that's the end of the matter, and that you have no further demands to fear. You will say to me, but I haven't 200,000 francs about me. Oh, I'm not extortionate. I don't demand that. I only ask one thing of you. Have the goodness to write what I am about to dictate to you. Here Thénardier paused. Then he added, emphasizing his words and casting a smile in the direction of the brazier, I warn you that I shall not admit that you don't know how to write. A grand inquisitor might have envied that smile. Thénardier pushed the table close to Monsieur Leblanc, and took an inkstand, a pen, and a sheet of paper from the drawer which he left half open, and in which gleamed the long blade of the knife. He placed the sheet of paper before Monsieur Leblanc. "Write," said he. The prisoner spoke at last. "How do you expect me to write? I am bound." "That's true. Excuse me," ejaculated Thénardier. "You are quite right." And turning to Bigrenaille, "Untie the gentleman's right arm." Panchaud, alias Printanier, alias Bigrenaille, executed Thénardier's order. When the prisoner's right arm was free, Thénardier dipped the pen in the ink and presented it to him. "Understand thoroughly, sir, that you are in our power, at our discretion, that no human power can get you out of this, and that we shall be really grieved if we are forced to proceed to disagreeable extremities. I know neither your name nor your address, but I warn you that you will remain bound until the person charged with carrying the letter which you are about to write shall have returned. Now be so good as to write." "What?" demanded the prisoner. "I will dictate." Monsieur Leblanc took the pen. Thénardier began to dictate. "My daughter—" The prisoner shuddered and raised his eyes to Thénardier. "Put down 'my daughter,'" said Thénardier. Monsieur Leblanc obeyed. Thénardier continued. "Come instantly." He paused. "You address her as thou, do you not?" "Who?" asked Monsieur Leblanc. "Parbleu!" cried Thénardier. "The little one, the lark." Monsieur Leblanc replied without the slightest apparent emotion. "I do not know what you mean." "Go on, nevertheless," ejaculated Thénardier, and he continued to dictate. "Come immediately. I am in absolute need of thee. The person who will deliver this note to thee is instructed to conduct thee to me. I am writing for thee. Come with confidence." Monsieur Leblanc had written the whole of this. Thénardier resumed. "Ah! Erase 'come with confidence.' That might lead her to suppose that everything was not as it should be, and that distrust is possible." Monsieur Leblanc erased the 3 words. "Now," pursued Thénardier, "sign it. What's your name?" The prisoner laid down the pen and demanded, "For whom is this letter?" "You know well," retorted Thénardier. "For the little one. I just told you so." It was evident that Thénardier avoided naming the young girl in question. He said the lark, he said the little one, but he did not pronounce her name, the precaution of a clever man guarding his secret from his accomplices. To mention the name was to deliver the whole affair into their hands, and to tell them more about it than there was any need of their knowing. He went on. "Sign. What is your name?" "Urbain Fabre," said the prisoner. Thénardier, with the movement of a cat, dashed his hand into his pocket and drew out the handkerchief which had been seized on Monsieur Leblanc. He looked for the mark on it and held it close to the candle. "U.F. That's it. Urbain Fabre. Well, sign it U.F." The prisoner signed. "As 2 hands are required to fold the letter, give it to me. I will fold it." That done, Thénardier resumed. "Address it, Mademoiselle Fabre, at your house. I know that you live a long distance from here, near Saint-Jacques-du-Haut-Pas, because you go to mass there every day, but I don't know in what street. I see that you understand your situation. As you've not lied about your name, you will not lie about your address. Write it yourself." The prisoner paused thoughtfully for a moment, then he took the pen and wrote, "Mademoiselle Fabre, at Monsieur Urbain Fabre, Rue Saint-Dominique d'Enfer, number 17. Thénardier seized the letter with a sort of feverish convulsion. "Wife!" he cried. The Thénardier woman hastened to him. "Here's the letter. You know what you have to do. There is a carriage at the door. Set out at once, and return ditto." And addressing the man with the meat-axe, "Since you have taken off your nose-screen, accompany the mistress. You will get up behind the fiacre. You know where you left the team?" "Yes," said the man. And depositing his axe in a corner, he followed Madame Thénardier. As they set off, Thénardier thrust his head through the half-open door and shouted into the corridor, "Above all things, don't lose the letter. Remember that you carry 200,000 francs with you." The Thénardier's harsh voice replied, "Be easy, I have it in my bosom." A minute had not elapsed when the sound of the cracking of a whip was heard, which rapidly retreated and died away. "Good," growled Thénardier. They're going at a fine pace. At such a gallop, the bourgeois will be back inside 3/4 of an hour." He drew a chair close to the fireplace, folding his arms and presenting his muddy boots to the brazier. "My feet are cold," said he. Only 5 ruffians now remained in the den with Thénardier and the prisoner. These men, through the black masks or paste which covered their faces, and made of them, at fear's pleasure, charcoal burners, negroes, or demons, had a stupid and gloomy air, and it could be felt that they perpetrated a crime like a bit of work tranquilly, without either wrath or mercy, with a sort of ennui. They were crowded together in one corner like brutes, and remained silent. Thénardier warmed his feet. The prisoner had relapsed into his taciturnity. A sombre calm had succeeded to the wild uproar which had filled the garret but a few moments before. The candle, on which a large stranger had formed, cast but a dim light in the immense hovel. The brazier had grown dull, and all those monstrous heads cast misshapen shadows on the walls and ceiling. No sound was audible except the quiet breathing of the old drunken man, who was fast asleep. End of Book 8, Chapter 20, Part 2.
Chapter 20, Part 3 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8, The Wicked Poor Man. Chapter 20, The Trap, Part 3. Marius waited in a state of anxiety that was augmented by every trifle. The enigma was more impenetrable than ever. Who was this little one whom Thénardier had called the Lark? Was she his Ursule? The prisoner had not seemed to be affected by that word, the Lark, and had replied in the most natural manner in the world, "I do not know what you mean." On the other hand, the 2 letters UF were explained. They meant Urbain Fabre, and Ursule was no longer named Ursule. This was what Marius perceived most clearly of all. A sort of horrible fascination held him nailed to his post, from which he was observing and commanding this whole scene. There he stood, almost incapable of movement or reflection, as though annihilated by the abominable things viewed at such close quarters. He waited in the hope of some incident, no matter of what nature, since he could not collect his thoughts and did not know upon what course to decide. "In any case," he said, "if she is the Lark, I shall see her, for the Thénardier woman is to bring her hither. That will be the end, and then I will give my life and my blood, if necessary, but I will deliver her. Nothing shall stop me." Nearly half an hour passed in this manner. Thénardier seemed to be absorbed in gloomy reflections. The prisoner did not stir. Still Marius fancied that at intervals, and for the last few moments, he had heard a faint, dull noise in the direction of the prisoner. All at once Thénardier addressed the prisoner. "By the way, Monsieur Fabre, I might as well say it to you at once." These few words appeared to be the beginning of an explanation. Marius strained his ears. "My wife will be back shortly. Don't get impatient. I think that the Lark really is your daughter, and it seems to me quite natural that you should keep her. Only listen to me a bit. My wife will go and hunt her up with your letter. I told my wife to dress herself in the way she did, so that your young lady might make no difficulty about following her. They will both enter the carriage with my comrade behind. Somewhere outside the barrier there is a trap harnessed to 2 very good horses. Your young lady will be taken to it. She will alight from the fiacre. My comrade will enter the other vehicle with her, and my wife will come back here to tell us it's done. As for the young lady, no harm will be done to her. The trap will conduct her to a place where she will be quiet, and just as soon as you have handed over to me those little 200,000 francs, she will be returned to you. If you have me arrested, my comrade will give a turn of his thumb to the Lark. That's all." The prisoner uttered not a syllable. After a pause, Thénardier continued. "It's very simple, as you see. There'll be no harm done unless you wish that there should be harm done. I'm telling you how things stand. I warn you so that you may be prepared." He paused. The prisoner did not break the silence, and Thénardier resumed. "As soon as my wife returns and says to me, 'The lark is on the way,' we will release you, and you will be free to go and sleep at home. You see that our intentions are not evil." Terrible images passed through Marius's mind. What? That young girl whom they were abducting was not to be brought back? One of those monsters was to bear her off into the darkness? Whither? And what if it were she? It was clear that it was she. Marius felt his heart stop beating. What was he to do? Discharge the pistol? Place all those scoundrels in the hands of justice? But the horrible man with a meat-axe would, none the less, be out of reach with the young girl, and Marius reflected on Thénardier's words, of which he perceived the bloody significance. "If you have me arrested, my comrade will give a turn of his thumb to the lark." Now it was not alone by the colonel's testament, it was by his own love, it was by the peril of the one he loved, that he felt himself restrained. This frightful situation, which had already lasted above half an hour, was changing its aspect every moment. Marius had sufficient strength of mind to review in succession all the most heartbreaking conjectures, seeking hope, and finding none. The tumult of his thoughts contrasted with the funereal silence of the den. In the midst of this silence, the door at the bottom of the staircase was heard to open and shut again. The prisoner made a movement in his bonds. "Here's the bourgeoise," said Thénardier. He had hardly uttered the words when the Thénardier woman did in fact rush hastily into the room, red, panting, breathless, with flaming eyes, and cried as she smote her huge hands on her thighs simultaneously, "False address!" The ruffian who had gone with her made his appearance behind her, and picked up his axe again. She resumed, "Nobody there! Rue Saint-Dominique, number 17. No, Monsieur Urbain Fabre, they know not what it means." She paused, choking, then went on. "Monsieur Thénardier, that old fellow has duped you. You are too good, you see. If it had been me, I'd have chopped the beast in 4 quarters to begin with. And if he had acted ugly, I'd have boiled him alive. He would have been obliged to speak and say where the girl is, and where he keeps his shiners. That's the way I should have managed matters. People are perfectly right when they say that men are a deal stupider than women. Nobody at number 17. It's nothing but a big carriage gate. No Monsieur Fabre in the Rue Saint-Dominique. And after all that racing and fee to the coachman and all, I spoke to both the porter and the portress, a fine stout woman, and they know nothing about him." Marius breathed freely once more. She, Ursule, or the lark, he no longer knew what to call her, was safe. While his exasperated wife vociferated, Thénardier had seated himself on the table. For several minutes he uttered not a word, but swung his right foot, which hung down, and stared at the brazier with an air of savage reverie. Finally he said to the prisoner, with a slow and singularly ferocious tone, "A false address? What did you expect to gain by that?" "To gain time!" cried the prisoner in a thundering voice, and at the same instant he shook off his bonds. They were cut. The prisoner was only attached to the bed now by one leg. Before the 7 men had time to collect their senses and dash forward, he had bent down into the fireplace, had stretched out his hand to the brazier, and had then straightened himself up again, and now Thénardier, the female Thénardier, and the ruffians, huddled in amazement at the extremity of the hovel, stared at him in stupefaction, as, almost free and in a formidable attitude, he brandished above his head the red-hot chisel, which emitted a threatening glow. The judicial examination, to which the ambush in the Gorbeau house eventually gave rise, established the fact that a large sou piece, cut and worked in a peculiar fashion, was found in the garret when the police made their descent on it. This sou piece was one of those marvels of industry which are engendered by the patience of the galleys in the shadows and for the shadows, marvels which are nothing else than instruments of escape. These hideous and delicate products of wonderful art are to jewelers' work what the metaphors of slang are to poetry. There are Benvenuto Cellinis in the galleys, just as there are Villons in language. The unhappy wretch who aspires to deliverance finds means, sometimes without tools, sometimes with a common wooden-handled knife, to saw a sou into 2 thin plates, to hollow out these plates without affecting the coinage stamp, and to make a furrow on the edge of the sou in such a manner that the plates will adhere again. This can be screwed together and unscrewed at will. It is a box. In this box he hides a watch-spring, and this watch-spring, properly handled, cuts good-sized chains and bars of iron. The unfortunate convict is supposed to possess merely a sou. Not at all. He possesses liberty. It was a large sou of this sort which, during the subsequent search of the police, was found under the bed near the window. They also found a tiny saw of blue steel, which would fit the sou. It is probable that the prisoner had this sou piece on his person at the moment when the ruffians searched him, that he contrived to conceal it in his hand, and that afterward, having his right hand free, he unscrewed it and used it as a saw to cut the cords which fastened him, which would explain the faint noise and almost imperceptible movements which Marius had observed. As he had not been able to bend down, for fear of betraying himself, he had not cut the bonds of his left leg. The ruffians had recovered from their first surprise. "Be easy," said Bigrenaille to Thénardier. "He still holds by one leg, and he can't get away. I'll answer for that. I tied that paw for him." In the meanwhile the prisoner had begun to speak. "You are wretches, but my life is not worth the trouble of defending it. When you think that you can make me speak, that you can make me write what I do not choose to write, that you can make me say what I do not choose to say—" He stripped up his left sleeve and added, "See here." At the same moment he extended his arm and laid the glowing chisel which he held in his left hand by its wooden handle on his bare flesh. The crackling of the burning flesh became audible, and the odor peculiar to chambers of torture filled the hovel. Marius reeled in utter horror. The very ruffians shuddered. Hardly a muscle of the old man's face contracted, and while the red-hot iron sank into the smoking wound, impassive and almost august, he fixed on Thénardier his beautiful glance, in which there was no hatred, and where suffering vanished in serene majesty. With grand and lofty natures, the revolts of the flesh and the senses, when subjected to physical suffering, cause the soul to spring forth, and make it appear on the brow, just as rebellions among the soldiery force the captain to show himself. "Wretches," said he, "have no more fear of me than I have for you." And tearing the chisel from the wound, he hurled it through the window, which had been left open. The horrible glowing tool disappeared into the night, whirling as it flew, and fell far away on the snow. The prisoner resumed. "Do what you please with me." He was disarmed. "Seize him," said Thénardier. Two of the ruffians laid their hands on his shoulder, and the masked man with a ventriloquist's voice took up his station in front of him, ready to smash his skull at the slightest movement. At the same time, Marius heard below him, at the base of the partition, but so near that he could not see who was speaking, this colloquy conducted in a low tone. "There is only one thing left to do. Cut his throat! That's it." It was the husband and wife taking counsel together. Thénardier walked slowly towards the table, opened the drawer, and took out the knife. Marius fretted with the handle of his pistol. Unprecedented perplexity! For the last hour he had had two voices in his conscience, the one enjoining him to respect his father's testament, the other crying to him to rescue the prisoner. These two voices continued uninterruptedly that struggle which tormented him to agony. Up to that moment he had cherished a vague hope that he should find some means of reconciling these two duties, but nothing within the limits of possibility had presented itself. However, the peril was urgent, the last bounds of delay had been reached. Thénardier was standing thoughtfully a few paces distant from the prisoner. Marius cast a wild glance about him, the last mechanical resource of despair. All at once a shudder ran through him. At his feet, on the table, a bright ray of light from the full moon illuminated and seemed to point out to him a sheet of paper. On this paper he read the following line written that very morning in large letters by the eldest of the Thénardier girls: "The bobbies are here." An idea, a flash, crossed Marius's mind. This was the expedient of which he was in search, the solution of that frightful problem which was torturing him, of sparing the assassin and saving the victim. He knelt down on his commode, stretched out his arm, seized the sheet of paper, softly detached a bit of plaster from the wall, wrapped the paper round it, and tossed the whole through the crevice into the middle of the den. It was high time. Thénardier had conquered his last fears, or his last scruples, and was advancing on the prisoner. "Something is falling!" cried the Thénardier woman. "What is it?" asked her husband. The woman darted forward and picked up the bit of plaster. She handed it to her husband. "Where did this come from?" demanded Thénardier. "Pardi!" ejaculated his wife. "Where do you suppose it came from? Through the window, of course." "I saw it pass," said Bigrenaille. Thénardier rapidly unfolded the paper and held it close to the candle. "It's in Éponine's handwriting. The devil!" He made a sign to his wife, who hastily drew near, and showed her the line written on the sheet of paper. Then he added in a subdued voice, "Quick, the ladder! Let's leave the bacon in the mousetrap and decamp." "Without cutting that man's throat?" asked the Thénardier woman. "We haven't the time." "Through what?" resumed Bigrenaille. "Through the window," replied Thénardier. "Since Ponine has thrown the stone through the window, it indicates that the house is not watched on that side." The mask with the ventriloquist's voice deposited his huge key on the floor, raised both arms in the air, and opened and clenched his fists 3 times rapidly without uttering a word. This was the signal like the signal for clearing the decks for action on board ship. The ruffians who were holding the prisoner released him. In the twinkling of an eye the rope ladder was unrolled outside the window and solidly fastened to the sill by the 2 iron hooks. The prisoner paid no attention to what was going on around him. He seemed to be dreaming or praying. As soon as the ladder was arranged, Thénardier cried, "Come, the bourgeois first!" and he rushed headlong to the window. But just as he was about to throw his leg over, Bigrenaille seized him roughly by the collar. "Not much! Come now, you old dog, after us!" "After us!" yelled the ruffians. "You are children," said Thénardier. "We are losing time. The police are on our heels." "Well," said the ruffians, "let's draw lots to see who shall go down first." Thénardier exclaimed, Are you mad? Are you crazy? What a pack of boobies! You want to waste time, do you? Draw lots, do you? By a wet finger, by a short straw, with written names thrown into a hat? Would you like my hat? Cried a voice on the threshold. All wheeled round. It was Javert. He had his hat in his hand, and was holding it out to them with a smile. End of Book 8, Chapter 20.
Chapters 21 and 22 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8, The Wicked Poor Man. Chapter 21. One should always begin by arresting the victims. At nightfall, Javert had posted his men, and had gone into ambush himself between the trees of the Rue de la Barrière des Gobelins, which faced the Gorbeau house on the other side of the boulevard. He had begun operations by opening his pockets and dropping into it the 2 young girls who were charged with keeping a watch on the approaches to the den. But he had only caged Azelma. As for Éponine, she was not at her post. She had disappeared, and he had not been able to seize her. Then Javert had made a point, and had bent his ear to waiting for the signal agreed upon. The comings and goings of the fiacres had greatly agitated him. At last, he had grown impatient, and, sure that there was a nest there, sure of being in luck, having recognized many of the ruffians who had entered, he had finally decided to go upstairs without waiting for the pistol shot. It will be remembered that he had Marius's pass-key. He had arrived just in the nick of time. The terrified ruffians flung themselves on the arms which they had abandoned in all the corners at the moment of flight. In less than a second, these 7 men, horrible to behold, had grouped themselves in an attitude of defence, one with his meat-axe, another with his key, another with his bludgeon, the rest with shears, pincers, and hammers. Thénardier had his knife in his fist. The Thénardier woman snatched up an enormous paving stone which lay in the angle of the window and served her daughters as an ottoman. Javert put on his hat again, and advanced a couple of paces into the room, with arms folded, his cane under one arm, his sword in its sheath. "Halt there!" said he. "You shall not go out by the window. You shall go through the door. It's less unhealthy. There are 7 of you. There are 15 of us. Don't let's fall to collaring each other like men of Auvergne." Bigrenaille drew out a pistol which he had kept concealed under his blouse, and put it in Thénardier's hand, whispering in the latter's ear, "It's Javert. I don't dare fire at that man. Do you dare?" "Parbleu!" replied Thénardier. "Well then, fire!" Thénardier took the pistol and aimed at Javert. Javert, who was only 3 paces from him, stared intently at him and contented himself with saying, "Come now, don't fire. You'll miss fire." Thénardier pulled the trigger. The pistol missed fire. "Didn't I tell you so?" ejaculated Javert. Bigrenaille flung his bludgeon at Javert's feet. "You're the emperor of the fiends. I surrender." "And you?" Javert asked the rest of the ruffians. They replied, "So do we." Javert began again calmly. "That's right, that's good. I said so, you are nice fellows." "I only ask one thing," said Bigrenaille, "and that is, that I might not be denied tobacco while I am in confinement." "Granted," said Javert. And turning round and calling behind him, "Come in now!" A squad of policemen, sword in hand, and agents armed with bludgeons and cudgels, rushed in at Javert's summons. They pinioned the ruffians. This throng of men, sparely lighted by the single candle, filled the den with shadows. "Handcuff them all!" shouted Javert. "Come on!" cried a voice, which was not the voice of a man, but of which no one would have ever said, "It is a woman's voice." The Thénardier woman had entrenched herself in one of the angles of the window, and it was she who had just given vent to this roar. The policemen and agents recoiled. She had thrown off her shawl, but retained her bonnet. Her husband, who was crouching behind her, was almost hidden under the discarded shawl, and she was shielding him with her body, as she elevated the paving stone above her head with the gesture of a giantess on the point of hurling a rock. "Beware!" she shouted. All crowded back towards the corridor. A broad open space was cleared in the middle of the garret. The Thénardier woman cast a glance at the ruffians who had allowed themselves to be pinioned, and muttered in hoarse and guttural accents, "The cowards!" Javert smiled, and advanced across the open space which the Thénardier was devouring with her eyes. "Don't come near me!" she cried, "or I'll crush you!" "What a grenadier!" ejaculated Javert. "You've got a beard like a man, mother, but I have claws like a woman." And he continued to advance. The Thénardier, dishevelled and terrible, set her feet far apart, threw herself backwards, and hurled the paving stone at Javert's head. Javert ducked, the stone passed over him, struck the wall behind, knocked off a huge piece of plastering, and, rebounding from angle to angle across the hovel, now luckily almost empty, rested at Javert's feet. At the same moment, Javert reached the Thénardier couple. One of his big hands descended on the woman's shoulder, the other on the husband's head. "The handcuffs!" he shouted. The policemen trooped in force, and in a few seconds Javert's order had been executed. The Thénardier female, overwhelmed, stared at her pinioned hands, and at those of her husband, who had dropped to the floor, and exclaimed, weeping, "My daughters!" "They are in the jug," said Javert. In the meanwhile, the agents had caught sight of the drunken man asleep behind the door, and were shaking him. He awoke, stammering, "Is it all over, Jondrette?" "Yes," replied Javert. The 6 pinioned ruffians were standing, and still preserved their spectral mien. All 3 besmeared with black, all 3 masked. "Keep on your masks," said Javert, and, passing them in review, with a glance of a Frederick II at a Potsdam parade, he said to the 3 chimney builders, "Good day, Bigrenaille. Good day, Brujon. Good day, 2 milliards." Then turning to the 3 masked men, he said to the man with the meat axe, "Good day, Guelemer," and to the man with the cudgel, "Good day, Babet," and to the ventriloquist, "Your health, Claquesous." At that moment, he caught sight of the ruffian's prisoner, who, ever since the entrance of the police, had not uttered a word, and had held his head down. "Untie the gentleman," said Javert, "and let no one go out." That said, he seated himself with sovereign dignity before the table, where the candle and the writing materials still remained, drew a stamped paper from his pocket, and began to prepare his report. When he had written the first lines, which are formulas that never vary, he raised his eyes. "Let the gentleman whom these gentlemen bound step forward." The policemen glanced round them. "Well," said Javert, "where is he?" The prisoner of the ruffians, Monsieur Leblanc, Monsieur Urbain Fabre, the father of Ursule, or the Lark, had disappeared. The door was guarded, but the window was not. As soon as he had found himself released from his bonds, and while Javert was drawing up his report, he had taken advantage of confusion, the crowd, the darkness, and of a moment when the general attention was diverted from him, to dash out of the window. An agent sprang to the opening and looked out. He saw no one outside. The rope ladder was still shaking. "The devil!" ejaculated Javert between his teeth. "He must have been the most valuable of the lot." Chapter 22. The little one who was crying in volume 2. On the day following that on which these events took place in the house on the Boulevard de l'Hôpital, a child, who seemed to be coming from the direction of the bridge of Austerlitz, was ascending the side alley on the right in the direction of the Barrière du Fontainebleau. Night had fully come. This lad was pale, thin, clad in rags, with linen trousers in the month of February, and was singing at the top of his voice. At the corner of the Rue du Petit Banquier, a bent old woman was rummaging in a heap of refuse by the light of a street lantern. The child jostled her as he passed, then recoiled, exclaiming, "Hello!" and I took it for an enormous, enormous dog. He pronounced the word enormous the second time, with a jeering swell of the voice, which might be tolerably well represented by capitals. An enormous, enormous dog. The old woman straightened herself up in a fury. "Nasty brat!" she grumbled. "If I hadn't been bending over, I know well where I would have planted my foot on you." The boy was already far away. "Kiss, kiss!" he cried. "After that, I don't think I was mistaken." The old woman, choking with indignation, now rose completely upright, and the red gleam of the lantern fully lighted up her livid face, all hollowed into angles and wrinkles, with crow's feet meeting the corners of her mouth. Her body was lost in the darkness, and only her head was visible. One would have pronounced her a mask of decrepitude carved out by a light from the night. The boy surveyed her. "Madame," said he, "does not possess that style of beauty which pleases me." He then pursued his road, and resumed his song. "Les rois coups des sabots s'en allaient à la chasse aux corbeaux." At the end of these 3 lines he paused. He had arrived in front of numbers 50 to 52, and finding the door fastened, he began to assault it with resounding and heroic kicks, which betrayed rather the man's shoes that he was wearing than the child's feet which he owned. In the meanwhile, the very old woman whom he had encountered at the corner of the Rue du Petit Banquier hastened up behind him, uttering clamorous cries and indulging in lavish and exaggerated gestures. "What's this? What's this? Lord God! He's battering the door down! He's knocking the house down!" The kicks continued. The old woman strained her lungs. "Is that the way buildings are treated nowadays?" All at once she paused. She had recognized the gamin. "What! So it's that imp!" "Why, it's the old lady," said the lad. "Good day, Bougon-Mouche. I have come to see my ancestors." The old woman retorted with a composite grimace, and a wonderful improvisation of hatred taking advantage of feebleness and ugliness, which was, unfortunately, wasted in the dark. "There's no one here." "Bah!" retorted the boy. "Where's my father?" "At La Force." "Come now! And my mother?" "At Saint-Lazare." "Well, and my sisters?" "At the Madelonettes." The lad scratched his head behind his ear, stared at Ma'am Bougon, and said, "Ah!" Then he executed a pirouette on his heel. A moment later, the old woman, who had remained on the doorstep, heard him singing in his clear, young voice as he plunged under the black elm trees in the wintry wind. "Les rois coups des sabots s'en allaient à la chasse aux corbeaux, monte sur deux échasses, quand on passait dessus, on lui payait 2 sous." End of Book 8, Chapters 21 and 22. End of Les Misérables, Volume 3, by Victor Hugo.